Welcome to Energy Bytes with ELS Analysis. This is our fourth episode, and today I have with me one of our co-founders, Samuel Zizek. How are you doing?
Yes, I'm doing very well. Thank you. Great to be here. Looking
Brilliant.
forward.
So we're back from a very long overdue Christmas and New Year's break. We've also decided to produce everything in-house, which has delayed our comeback slightly. And much has happened since our last episode, most notably in the US with the installation of the 47th president. So today I thought we would have an all US episode with the new Trump presidency. Does that sound all right with you, Samuel?
Yeah, why not? Although I'm sure we will sort of slide back into Europe a little bit too, no?
Absolutely. Let's get cracking then. So, President Trump signed an order declaring a national energy emergency, casually saying it means you can do whatever you have to do to get out of that problem. The order essentially directs federal agencies to use eminent domain, which means that the power of the government can take private property and put it to public use. And in this instance, to speed up energy deployment. No president has ever declared a national energy emergency before, but regional emergencies were declared in the 1970s during fuel shortages. And back then, President Carter gave governors the ability to ease these regulations, but cautioned them to do so. And unlike the energy shortages during the Carter administration, the US situation today is very different with, high oil and gas production. Isn't that right, Samuel?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think the U.S. The state of the U.S. oil production and gas production, in fact, is extremely healthy. It's in rude health. In fact, it's the highest ever. Last year was a new record, following a record year before that. So it's there's not a shortage really of oil in the U.S. Obviously, I mean, in 1973 it was that was the oil crisis. That was a very tough time. We're both too young to remember it, but we've seen the pictures, right, of mile-long queues to forecourts, rationing, people not being able to fill up as much as they would need, with all the knock-on effects on society that had, like people not being able to go to work, take the kids to school, etc., etc. I mean, this was a problem in Europe too, but it hit America very hard, obviously. Today, I mean, it's diametrical, isn't it? Now, I think it's very interesting though that to talk about this crisis, and of course, this is very. I mean, the Secretary of the Treasury also has his three priorities, right? He calls them the three threes. It's bringing the deficit down to 3%, the budget deficit. It is bringing inflation down to at least under 3, and it is to increase U.S. crude production with 3 million barrels a day of capacity this year. So I mean that's it's quite tremendous, and it won't happen. I think that's the problem. It grew, even though much has been said about the Biden era, regulations not favoring oil, etc. We did reach record after record. It's not really a red tape problem. Of course, you could potentially do more by deregulating some more, but at the same time, industry is bracing for something else because we are further away from the sweet spots, further out into the fringes, drilling in the fringes of the shale formations. It's just not as rewarding, and it costs more. And prices are not really reflecting a much larger need for oil. I mean, it's not like the oil market is actually requesting more oil. In fact, could well say the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, more drilling would lower prices for oil and gas, possibly. And the flip side with that would be that lower price would then discourage new drilling and sending prices back up. And Trump has promised that he would bring
Yeah.
energy prices down in the US.
Yes, and I mean at the same time as this is the clear policy in the US, to both bring energy prices down and get drillers to drill more, he's also telling OPEC, telling Saudi Arabia, there's one thing you need to do really, and that is to bring oil prices down. Well, they've been actually taking a lot of production off the market. OPEC sits on more than 5.5 million barrels a day of spare production capacity today in order to stabilize prices. So, yeah, they could bring prices down to a great cost to themselves, but also, of course, to American oil producers because it's a global price. So, if this overhang would hit the market, we don't actually need American growth for that to happen. If OPEC would do something like that, or some members of OPEC, then we'd have significantly lower prices. And who would then want to drill in the US? I think it was very interesting. The Financial Times actually did a mapping out last week among the major shale players in the US. Well, more than half or two-thirds were seeing significantly less or a little bit less investment, capital expenditure in drilling this year. And it was less than a third who actually saw a small increase, and pretty much nobody saw a large increase in expenditure. So, the industry has already, even, despite knowing now for some months that Trump is on his way in, the industry is sort of, preparing to cut back because they obviously don't want to get burned again, as they were in 2014. Well, it's maybe too early for shale to remember, but in 2008, for instance. 2008, 2009.
On the gas side, or the LNG side, more specifically, Trump is to lift Biden's freeze on LNG exports. And just before we stepped in to record this podcast, Germany's Scholz welcomed U.S. turnaround on energy policy, essentially stating that more oil and gas exports is good for Europe and for Germany. And yes, more export could drive prices down. So, and that would be good in the short term for European industry. But I mean, as we point out here at ELS, the transition, the green transition needs high prices. What would this mean for European competitiveness and a sort of long-term vision to transition to fossil-free and renewable power?
Yeah, this is actually tremendously important, and I think we're just starting to see an extraordinarily shift in the playing field in Europe. And it's Europe has needed some good news for a long time, and I don't think this is it. In fact, for some people it will feel like it in the short run, for sure. But Europe has a massive competitiveness problem, as we've known, has been discussed well over at least last year, and particularly around the Draghi report and other very sort of important discussions that were held. This competition problem is just going to get hit now by potentially then by US trade war. At the same time, of course, we have China on the other side. That relationship is not easy to manage, and in order to try to avert a trade war with Trump, we probably have to be tougher in our relationship with China, as was during his last term. So that's one challenge, and then of course the other challenge here now of we are in a slump, an economic slump, particularly Germany is. The cost of the transition are feeling, they're being felt, and we are seeing how some of the discontent coming out of that politically is being sort of now for a good few years being swooped up by ever stronger radical parties, sort of on the sort of nationalist far right fringe. So here it's clearly sort of setting the stage for what I think it was very, very, very important and a bit underreported, at least here in Sweden, that the EPP, the big center-right grouping in the parliament last week, I think ahead of last week was it, actually decided to advocate for a pause in climate regulations. And this is very important because we've so far we had a very sort of ironclad agreement among all mainstream parties in the European Parliament that Europe is leading the way in the transition of our industry, of our economies, and of energy, of course. And now I'm not sure we can say that we have that anymore. And that, of course, creates an incredible uncertainty amongst market actors, industry, energy industry, investors.
One could argue that it's not CBAM that's going to revive European industry. It's cheap and clean energy. And if we're not pushing for the industrial acts, then we need to go ahead and stimulate investments in the cheap energy sources. From Trump's perspective, energy and AI is very much sort of intertwined with national security, and which is itself tied to the competition with China. And there's been quite a bit of worry from these major projects like Starlink, which is a joint venture between OpenAI and other companies, about the capacity of the US states not being able to meet that demand. And here lies an issue with many of Trump's politics. On one hand, you might have a lack of supply, and on the other hand, he's cracking down on federal support schemes to stimulate investments into new production, into new fossil-free production. Can Trump be diplomatic here, with market reality sort of outweighing ideological standpoints? What could it mean for these federal stimulus packages?
Well, to some extent, it's a bit too early to say, because we will see the renewable industry in the US is big. It's big business. So they too will obviously analyze what's starting to happen, and then they will start to lobby. And Trump, has never sort of shied away from saying that he wants to have a big ear towards industry. So we shall see what their lobbying will result in. However, of course, there seems to be an ideological bent against renewables. There seems maybe more than an ideological bent. There seems to be a bit of a feeling around on top of the MAGA movement that feel that renewables have been to some extent rammed down our throats, sort of in the US. Clearly, there is that kind of feeling, and that will probably mean that the Trump administration will remain largely, if not hostile, at least ill-disposed towards some of the renewables. At the same time, we've seen extraordinary renewable growth, very, very profitable renewable growth in large parts of the US, quite significantly in red states like Texas and some other states. And it's generally obviously onshore wind, it's solar, it's batteries, etc. And I actually don't necessarily think that they might start to suffer. So this is going to be a problem for the large capital intensive long-term projects like offshore wind, unfortunately, which require support to get off the ground, off the sea bed, or whatever one want to call it. But I think for them this will be very hard. But for wind developers in the states that are already favorably disposed towards them, this will not necessarily maybe be that noticeable.
No, and Trump signed an executive order ending the leasing to offshore wind farms, and of course we saw Ørsted write-downs that were revealed hours after Trump's inauguration, making their stock tank. I mean, will these kind of companies relocate their funds to Europe, or is it more tentative?
Well, that's very interesting, because of course a few years ago, when Biden launched the IRA, we saw a massive capital shift away from Europe, from green funds, from infrastructure funds looking for green investments, etc., from Europe to the US. A lot of capital just disappeared away to the US, which gave better terms. Will we see them come back? Well, if we hit a pause button now in Europe, then I'm not sure we will. Where is the green growth happening now? Well, it's actually happening in China. That's not necessarily open for much of the pension fund investments. To some extent it is, but maybe only to a certain extent. So, will we actually see those money being coming back, returning, or will they have to be a bit more eclectic sort of in how they find and what they invest in? Work with their own mandates to maybe squeeze in more types of projects around the world and in America maybe. Because I think the troubling thing here, and it goes back to competitiveness, of course, is that when Biden's IRA came, the US became more competitive from an investor point of view for green investors. If you're onshore wind, for instance, or solar or battery, you still find the US probably more profitable than you do much of Europe on the whole. This is really the big challenge. And of course, at the same time, we have technology. I mean, China is steaming ahead. They don't stop building bigger battery factories, solar, wind, offshore wind even, as well as nuclear and coal power plants. Technology wise, if we hit the pause button, this will obviously hit European technology providers who are already struggling or even falling behind, while the Chinese suppliers, they seem to be continuing going from strength to strength.
I see that time is slowly running out, but before we wrap up, as an energy advisor firm, this is something that we've alluded to throughout the conversation. We've noticed a shift in how investors and developers approach the market. It's no longer just about planning for investments 2030, 2040 and beyond. It's about truly understanding where the market is, partly today, but also in the meantime, until we get to the 2040 to 2050. And that's why we at Analysis have created a new project. Can you talk about that briefly, Sam?
Our clients are basically looking at, as you say, uncertain picture. What to do in the long term? Well, we see, politics are not really giving us good direction for it. So then you have the short term and midterm. Well, if the long term is uncertain, you're probably disposed to sort of try to extend the lifespan of your current business in the way it operates, your current facilities, etc. This is very much, I think, where a lot of people now are heading. They want to extend it, and they also want to, everybody's trying to grow the business, obviously, so they try to grow it in a way which fits most with the short term operations rather than the long term, because the uncertainty about the long term has become so big. And we can only look back to Sweden, where we're both sitting, where the question marks have now been hovering over the sort of climate ambitions of the government and the steering sort of it for some time. And everybody just looked towards Brussels instead and towards EU and said, that would give us clarity. And now we hear from Brussels, well, there might be a pause. Okay, well, in that case, maybe looking at the short-term solutions and trying to find bridges from that, how to make the short-term solutions sort of, and maybe your investments for the midterm future-proof, so that they, in a future where, in a slightly longer-term future, where quite likely the issues of climate change come back onto the political agenda, you will be in a position which is not worse in a few years' time, but actually better. So building flexibility, building the potential of switching energy sources, fuels, etc. Those kind of things are very interesting. And this is what we're going to look to and try to help our clients with, and just kind of to understand what is going on a recurring basis in order to navigate this, well, much tougher surrounding where actually we have no kind of steering along the long-term plans and the long-term visions.
If this has captured your interest, contact us, ELS Analysis, about ELS Vista, a concise format that breaks down the future of liquids, power, and gas markets. And I think that's all from us today.
Thank you.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much for today.
Cheers.